blocks in the Great Pyramid weighed more than twice as much. Although no description or narrative account has ever been found telling how these massive stone monuments were created, this tomb drawing contains tantalizing clues. It shows the 160 workers needed to move a single statue. How many more must it have taken to build a pyramid? Many believe the stones were moved on enormous wood sleds along mud-slicked paths. Others think rolling logs were used, or even canals built from the Nile, and the stones floated in on barges. Ramps most likely raised the stones into place. But how they built on such a scale, and with such uncanny precision, is the greatest wonder of this great wonder of the world. And the plunder continued down through the centuries. In the unbridled looting of the 1800s, nothing was sacred. A giant head of Ramses was dragged from the desert and brought to the British Museum.
I found it near the remains of its body and chair, apparently smiling at me at the thought of being taken to England. Gianni Belzoni, 1880.
Even a man of science, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, left a trail of destruction in his wake. A brilliant scholar, Mariette discovered the long-lost tomb of a cult that worshipped sacred animals 3,000 years ago. Deep under the ground in Saqqara, a maze of catacombs contained massive stone coffins that once held mummies of full-grown bulls. Each granite chamber weighed 80 tons. And yet they too had been robbed, the lids pried open in ancient times by a force Mariette could not even begin to comprehend. Only one sarcophagus remained unopened, but Mariette and his men came well armed. Mariette was a product of his time, as greedy for treasure as for knowledge, shamelessly indifferent to the desecration he would cause the sacred tombs.
In the raw pillaging days, it was just, hey, let's get the biggest kind of stuff we can, and they blasted it with dynamite to get it out, and they dropped it in the Nile by mistake when the winches didn't work, and all sorts of chaos. They would take dynamite, they'd set it at the edge of the pyramid, wham, just let it go to see, you know, is there a hole in there, is there next to a burial chamber, and so on.
Despite the best efforts of Egyptian authorities, illicit excavations continued. The most persistent offenders lived here, in Kurna, the village of the robbers. For generations, unscrupulous dealers came from all over the world to Kurna to purchase pieces of Egypt's past. A booming black market flourished in these narrow streets. In Kurna, trade in ancient treasure became a way of life. As a young man, Hussein Aboud al-Rasul often dug for illicit artifacts.
Kurna is built above a lot of artifacts and antiquities. No one really knows how much is buried underneath here. There are hundreds of tombs which are as yet unopened and undiscovered. But all the villagers, no exception, know the value of what they are living above. And whenever anyone can sell something, they do.
The town is located on an ancient burial ground. Rumors spread of looters' tunnels, but more likely these were the long-since robbed graves of minor nobles and even commoners. The village of the robbers earned its reputation, but the worst looting was not the work of amateurs. This is plunder with a pedigree. Plunder in the name of art and science. Plunder to fill national museums all over the world.
Museum curators are trained to acquire. They do three things. They acquire, they exhibit, and they publish. And the sexiest thing is to acquire. And the resentment of people living in the countries that were being pillaged finally got to the point where it had to be taken seriously by the industrial powers, who were the collectors. We don't want any more of this theft. And you people who are the scholars, you people who are the curators, you're the ones that are egging them on. You're contributing to the criminal behavior by saying, we'll buy anything in sight. And they could never get the runners. You can't get the night diggers. But you can sure get the people who say, this is our newest acquisition, and put it on a pedestal in New York or Berlin or what have you. It gets pretty embarrassing.
You know, the Egyptian civilization does not belong to Egypt only, but belongs to everyone all over the world. We as Egyptians are guardian to this civilization. And this is why we, all of us, Egyptians, Americans, Europeans, has to cooperate in stopping this crime.
Protecting the country's rich heritage is now the job of Egypt's Antiquities Police. From his Cairo headquarters, Colonel Meckled leads a skilled unit of investigators, perhaps the best in the world at what they do.
Any theft, large or small, constitutes a threat to our culture and heritage. It's a heavy responsibility. We aren't just fighting crime, we're protecting our past. I love this culture. When I hold a statue in my hands, I'm holding a piece of my heritage. I feel the continuity between the present and the past.
But despite the best efforts of the Antiquities Police, the plunder continues. In 1992, a secluded temple was descended upon by a daring gang of thieves. Their target, one of the temple's most important and imposing relics.
We got a report on the theft of the head of a huge statue from an area about 100 miles west of Aswan, almost in the middle of the desert and very difficult to reach. This was a hugely important piece because it was a statue of Ramses the Great. In cases like this, everybody in the department, regardless of rank, pulls together to solve the theft and retrieve the stolen artifacts.
Colonel Meckled's team eventually captured the thieves and recovered the stolen head. But the damage had been done. Yet it was not stone, but flesh and blood, the mummies of ancient Egypt's greatest rulers, who would suffer the worst desecration of all. The pharaohs have not been left in peace. The fate of this mummy is not uncommon, only its ancestry is. This is the mummy of Tutankhamun, King Tut. Over the years, he has been rudely manhandled. But mummies suffered far worse indignities. They became the objects of bizarre rituals and beliefs.
In medieval times, pounded up ancient Egyptian mummy was considered to be a powerful medicine, to say nothing of an aphrodisiac. Pounded mummy was worn by the King of France in a leather pouch on his belt. A thriving market in what was called Mumia developed throughout Europe. And there were numerous instances in the late 18th and early 19th century of people throwing mummy unwrapping parties. And groups of doctors and scientists would get together and they would throw a reception and they would formally unwrap the mummy. And the collection of mummies from there became big business.
For over 1,000 years, human beings have been treated as display pieces, historical oddities, props for cheap magicians. But another chance discovery, more than a century ago, would forever change the way mummies were treated. Ironically, the astonishing find was made above the town of Kurna, the village of the robbers. Here, in a cave, lay the coffins of 32 kings and queens, including the mummy of Ramses the Great. 3,000 years ago, their royal priests carefully identified each ruler and hid their remains in this secret burial chamber. For their own protection, Egyptian authorities now removed the royal mummies from their tombs. And this collection of ancient rulers formed a funeral procession unique in human history. All along the Nile, Egyptians gathered to pay their respects as the eerie caravan of ancient rulers made its final journey north to Cairo. Today, a century later, Ramses and all the royal mummies lie in an upper gallery of the Cairo. Nothing was sacred. A giant head of Ramses was dragged from the desert and brought to the British Museum.
I found it near the remains of its body and chair, apparently smiling at me at the thought of being taken to England. Gianni Belzoni, 1880.
Even a man of science, the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, left a trail of destruction in his wake. A brilliant scholar, Mariette discovered the long-lost tomb of a cult that worshipped sacred animals 3,000 years ago. The workers needed to move a single statue. How many more must it have taken to build a pyramid? Many believe the stones were moved on enormous wood sleds along mud-slicked paths. Others think rolling logs were used, or even canals built from the Nile, and the stones floated in on barges. Ramps most likely raised the stones into place. But how they built on such a scale, and with such uncanny precision, is the greatest wonder of this great wonder of the world. And the plunder continued down through the centuries. In the unbridled looting of the 1800s, 9 blocks in the Great Pyramid weighed more than twice as much. Although no description or narrative account has ever been found telling how these massive stone monuments were created, this tomb drawing contains tantalizing clues. It shows the 160